Hey everybody, glad to have y'all with us again today. Today is another somber day. Today marks the 30th anniversary of the day that Michael Chappell lost his freedom. Now, 30 years ago today for me, I was pregnant, about to have twins. My mother was in a car accident, literally all about the same time. So my world was upside down. And I can't even imagine what was going on in the Chappell household. Of course, during that time as well, there are a lot of things going on in the world. Bill Clinton had just become president about 3 months before. Pablo Escobar was turning Bogota, Colombia, into a complete war zone. And then, of course, we had the federal government waging war on a small religious sect in Waco, Texas. At that time, the police officers around the country were just under an intense scrutiny due to the videotape beating of Rodney King and the roid raging cops of Atlanta. But back close to home in Gwinnett County, a police officer by the name of Michael Chappell was believed to be involved in the murder of Emma Jean Thompson, a Sugar Hill grandmother. So he was aware of this investigation into Miss Thompson's death and allegations that a cop might be involved, but he had no idea, however, that he was that suspect, and thought that he was about to be summoned to headquarters by Jack Burnett for routine questioning. So while Chappell didn't know that he or that Chief Detective John Laddie and others had decided a week ago that Chappell was actually the bad guy, he really didn't matter. It didn't matter what he said. He was going to go to jail. And then the nightmare, which is still going on today, began. So, Henry, what can you tell us about Mike's arrest, his interrogation, and the incarceration?
Well, it's interesting that you point out that Mike didn't know that he was a suspect. You know, a week prior, on the 16th of April, that evening, Steve Klein, in his report, identified that Michael Chappell was GCPD's prime suspect in the murder of Emma Jean Thompson. Now, what's interesting is at that point, they met, and that would have been the same John Laddie that you mentioned, Jack Burnett, Steve Klein, Chief or Assistant Chief Carl White. And they decided that not only would they focus exclusively on Michael Chappell, and that led to them ignoring a mountain of evidence pointing away from Michael Chappell and pointing to the real perpetrators. But it also they also decided that they would keep this very quiet, essentially keep it secret from the department until they were ready to act. Now, what that meant is that they had decided that a police officer was, a wanton murderer and was, going around murdering little old ladies for a few bucks. And instead of doing what, any department would do in such a situation, which is take that person off of the streets and call in the GBI or the FBI even for the non-conflicted investigation, GCPD decided, hey, we're going to keep control of this because, as Michael Chappell always says, he who controls the information controls the situation. And so they investigated Mike, quietly. Now, Danny Porter said on the podcast to Sean Kite that it didn't matter what Michael Chappell said in that interrogation. He was not leaving that police department free that night. So they had decided no matter what they learned in that interrogation, Michael Chappell was going to be arrested. What's included in that is the fact that they learned for the first time, essentially, that Michael Chappell had a pretty rock solid alibi. He had 6 firemen and other first responders that said, yeah, he was at the firehouse until 10 o'clock. So through the entire window of the crime, which was by the medical examiner, was given from 9 p.m. to 10 p.m., and there are other reasons why the district attorney determined that the murder occurred at about 9:45. Well, Michael Chappell was at Firehouse 14 Of course, we now know that in addition to the eyewitnesses to Mike's whereabouts, we also have the suppressed dispatch tape that proves that Mike was indeed at the firehouse. But back to the 23rd, the day of his arrest, it's interesting. They literally had no physical evidence against Mike at that time. The second search of his patrol car that would sit unprotected for 6 days has not yet occurred. In fact, the first search had not yet occurred. The first search, which concluded that there was no evidence in Mike's patrol car, had not even occurred. So they had no physical evidence whatsoever. They had an eyewitness that day, 2 eyewitnesses that day that said, well, we saw a 6-foot individual, about 180 pounds, 180 to 200 pounds, standing next to the victim's car. Well, again, we all know that Michael Chappell was 6'7", 290 pounds of solid muscle. So that's like seeing Sean Kipe and
Next to
describing me. and that just, that just doesn't work. And of course, we've all seen the artist rendering of the back of the officer, which is all the eyewitnesses saw. And there's just no way that anyone would have seen Mike Chappell standing at 6'7", wearing a 5-inch high trooper hat, which would have had him at over 7 feet tall, wearing a big yellow rain slicker, and would have said, yeah, it was an average cop. They would have said, I saw Big Bird in a Bigfoot, or Bigfoot in a Big Bird costume. And that's just not what they saw. So GCPD had a real problem going into this interrogation and coming out of this interrogation, because coming out of this interrogation, not only did Mike vehemently deny that he had any involvement in this, but he clearly told them what he had done that night, where he had been that night. He said, that's where I was, that's who I was with, and that's what I did. And of course, everything that he said proved to be true. And so, as we've said many times with the Michael Chappell is Innocent Project, you can't be 2 places at one time. And GCPD learned 30 years ago tonight that Michael Chappell was somewhere else when this murder occurred. But for some reason, they had already made their decision. Danny Porter told Sean Kipe, like we said on the podcast, didn't matter what Michael Chappell said in that interview, he was going to jail that night. And that was 30 years ago today, and he is still incarcerated as we speak. And of course, as we know, we are fighting to resolve that. We are fighting for justice, and we are looking very forward to the habeas hearing, which at this point should be at the end of July. I will tell our listeners this, and I think everyone will be anxiously waiting close of business tomorrow. But the state has until the end of business tomorrow to make their answer to our initial filing. And as of Friday evening, they had not yet answered. So the state's 20 days to respond ends tomorrow, close of business. So
Henry, do us a favor and kind of remind everybody what that is and what the responses could be.
So we filed again a petition of writ of habeas corpus, which essentially is Michael Chappell saying, I am being incarcerated in violation of my civil rights. And those civil rights are represented in the Brady violations and the prosecutorial misconduct and other violations of Michael's civil rights. You heard Bill Weston on the podcast say there's a potential that there's a Garrity violation, which is essentially that Mike answered questions that night in that interrogation under threat of, he was reporting to his superiors, and essentially he was under threat of losing his job if he didn't comply. So he complied and answered questions without a lawyer present, things of that nature. So those are just a a small sample of some of the potential Brady violations. I pointed one out the other day. Danny Porter says that the document that I made public, that Ball made public, the supplemental report that names Dennis Shelton as the suspect in the murder of Imogene Thompson, the murder and armed robbery, that it's missing a page. The funny thing is I actually agree with him, because if you read from, I think it's page 2 to page 3, there is no continuity. It's like what's being discussed on page 2 does not flow into what's being discussed on page 3. So it's like there's a missing page. But I didn't put that in evidence. I made it public, yes, but I didn't put it in evidence. And if you look at the top of page 1, it's Exhibit 14, I believe. And I got that document from Phil Sullivan's files from the transcript. So that's what Danny Porter put into evidence, those 4 pages. It's interesting that he essentially knows it's missing a page. I wonder how he knows that. But that, could in fact be a Brady violation. If there's a page of that missing, my suspicion is that it would just be more incriminating evidence against Dennis Shelton and Michael Thompson, because everything in the 4 pages that we have is all focused on the, what I call the Sugar Hill Gang, Dennis Shelton, Michael Thompson, and their little cohorts, who were all running around breaking laws and involved in all kinds of criminal activity, according to multiple sources, which GCPD was very well aware of. And so perhaps that's another Brady violation, and we'll see how that comes out.
Yeah, I mean, we could probably go on and on for days with all of the injustices that have been done here in this case. So, but back to it, as far as the court having to respond by the end of business tomorrow, they have to respond in one of 2 ways, and explain that again.
Well, what's due tomorrow is essentially an acknowledgement of service and that, who is going to be handling this case on behalf of the state. It's not necessarily their case before the judge, although they may speak to some of the evidence that we presented or not. But if they respond, then essentially that just means that we're preparing for the hearing, which will be at the end of July. Now, the outcome of that would be that a judge would essentially be making a determination if Mike's rights are truly being violated. And the outcomes that I'm aware of, and again, I'm not an attorney, so please, forgive me. I'm relaying the information as best as I understand it. But a judge could vacate Mike's sentence with prejudice, and that would essentially be what we're all praying for. That would be our greatest hope, because that would be Mike's exoneration. With prejudice means the judge sees clear and convincing evidence that Michael Chappell was wrongfully convicted, and he would overturn the verdict, and there would be no retrial. He would simply order Mike released from prison, and he would be exonerated under those circumstances. Truth be told, in these kinds of cases, it's more likely that a judge would vacate without prejudice, which essentially means that he sees reason to believe that Chappell deserves a new trial, but then he would turn it back over to the original jurisdiction, which would be Gwinnett County, and then Patsy Austin Gatson would have to determine whether or not she is going to bring fresh charges and try Mike again. We believe, for various reasons, that that may not occur. So that outcome, we believe, would also be favorable to Mike, if a judge vacated without prejudice. And then a judge, ultimately could say, no, I don't see cause here, or there could be some other technicality that they rule on, which is what they've done so many times in the past. We believe that we have enough information to overcome that. And certainly, I don't want to speak for the attorneys, but it has been conveyed to me that the attorneys feel strongly about our position and about what we have presented to the court. So we look forward to Mike's day in court.
Well, that's wonderful. There's so many what ifs, or this could happen or that could happen. And I want us to be praying, obviously, that he will be released without prejudice and that this thing will be over. But what I do know,
with prejudice.
Sorry, let me get that right. Lord, if we're claiming this stuff, we got to have it right. But what I do know is Mike is a man of faith, and he stands strong on that. I stand strong in my faith. And the word of God says in Psalm 146:7, he says, he upholds the cause of the oppressed, gives food to the hungry, and the Lord sets prisoners free. And that's what I believe. This is what's going to happen. And we may not understand why this has had to go down this way, but there's a purpose behind everything. And those shackles are going to fall soon. Those gates are going to be open, and Mike is going to be free. I truly believe that. So, folks, thanks again for joining us on this day. Just remember the chapel family, as it is a very difficult day. Remember Mike. Reach out, send words of encouragement if you can. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thanks, Henry.